We have been just taking some time and looking at Jesus' famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And so basically what we're doing throughout the summer months is just kind of walking through this sermon chapter by chapter, verse by verse, Matthew 5 all the way through Matthew chapter 7. In fact, if you've got your Bibles, do me a favor. Let's go ahead and turn there. We're going to be in Matthew 5 today. Again, that's Matthew chapter 5. If you don't have a Bible, we should have Bibles in the chairs in front of you. If you've got one of those, we're going to be on page 810. Again, that's page 810. And while you're turning there, I've got to take a little bit of time and do a little bit of review just to catch everybody up. Because remember, this is one long, continuous sermon of Jesus, right? And so what he talks about every single week is going to set the stage for what we talk about the next week. Everything just kind of flows week to week to week. And so what we've been talking about, really, what Jesus has been talking about the past several weeks is the importance of the lesser commands of God. You see, for a lot of us, our natural temptation is to focus on the big stuff, right? We want to make sure that we keep the big commandments in line. For example, Jesus kicked off this entire series by saying, "You have heard it said, don't murder." Now, for all of us, I hope all of us, and if not, see me afterwards, we'll do some counseling. But for all of us, we would consider murder to be one of the greater commands, right? Like, that's a biggie, if not the biggie. Like, don't murder. And again, our natural temptation is to focus on the big stuff. But notice what Jesus says. He says, "You have heard it said, don't murder, but I tell you, don't be angry." Because what Jesus is talking about here is the importance of the details, the importance of the little ones. And the problem that we have is it's so easy for us to overlook the little stuff, isn't it? And the reason it's easy, we justify this all the time, don't we? We say things like, well, as long as I don't act on it, like, it's not a big deal. It's inside. As long as it stays inside, then it's not a problem. But what Jesus understands and what we desperately need to understand is that what's inside never stays inside. That what's inside eventually comes out. And so we have to learn to keep our anger in check and deal with our anger in a healthy way. And when we deal with our anger in a healthy way, by extension, we're not going to murder. Because murder often comes from a place of unresolved anger. The same thing was true the next week. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, don't commit adultery." Again, adultery is a biggie. Like, don't commit adultery. That is a greater sin. But Jesus says, "I tell you, don't lust." For a lot of us, same thing is true, right? Lust is an internal thing. As long as it stays inside, then what's the problem? What's the harm? But what Jesus understands, again, is what's inside eventually comes out. But if we learn to deal with our lust in a healthy way, then we don't have to worry about adultery. By the way, the next teaching that Jesus gives is on divorce. There's a progression here, right? That lust leads to adultery, that leads to divorce. If you want to keep the greater commands, you focus on the details. And then last week, we talked about oaths. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, don't break an oath." And again, an oath was one of the greater commands. And in their world, in their culture, oaths were an everyday part of their life and their society. You see, the problem is that people in their culture, thank goodness ours isn't like this, but in their culture, people were very unreliable. I know, we're so blessed. We live in a society where everybody's good for their word, right? Oh, good, I'm glad we're laughing. Yeah, but no, I'm not getting there. Like, they're living in a world where people were always breaking their word. And so what they would do, if you had to make a deal with somebody, you would make them take an oath, usually to their God. And the reason they would make an oath to their God is because if they broke their oath, then that God would be the one who avenged their oath breaking, right? The God would be the one who held them accountable. And so you have heard it said, "You shall not keep an oath." But Jesus says, "I tell you not to take an oath at all." And then he goes on to say, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no." Basically, that we are to be people of integrity. People who don't just say that we're going to do something, but actually do it. And the point here is when the time comes when we need to make a deal with somebody and we have a track record of being faithful, we have a track record of keeping our word, then that other person is going to be like, you know what, don't worry about the oath. I know you, and I know that you're good for it. And I know that you're going to do what you say that you're going to do. That we need to be people of integrity. Now, believe it or not, this flows right into what we're going to talk about this week. Because if we're to be people who don't make oaths at all, then one side of that coin is that people are going to look at us and say, you know what, you're good for it. I trust you. But the other side of that coin is that we have to trust others. Isn't it frustrating how other people aren't always as trustworthy as we are? How other people don't always keep their word the way that we want to keep our word. Not that we always do, right? And so the question is, how do you respond when somebody breaks their oath? How do you respond when somebody wrongs you? And so what Jesus is going to talk about for the next couple of verses is this idea of justice and retaliation. And really, we're going to be looking at their legal system. How do you respond when somebody wrongs you? And so with all that said, we're going to dive in. If you've got your Bibles, hopefully you're there by now. Matthew 5:38 says this. Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And again, whenever you hear this phrase, you have heard it said, oftentimes, not always, and we're going to see an example of that next week. Don't want to miss out on next week. But oftentimes, that phrase, you have heard it said, is a way of talking and referencing the Old Testament. And this one comes to us out of Exodus 21, verse 24, where it says, and a lot of you guys probably know this one, it says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and a foot for a foot. Now, could we be honest? How many of us, when we hear that verse, is there this part of us, if not all of us, that really wants to push back? How many of us hear that phrase, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, and there's this part of us that's like, like really? That's kind of harsh, isn't it? Like that's kind of disgusting, gory, violent, horrible. Like I think for most of us, if not all of us, our natural temptation is to want to push back against that. And the reason that we do is because we're imaginative people, right? How many times do we hear that verse? And maybe now that I think about it, this is a weird Brian thing. I don't know. But how many of us, when we hear that verse, do we kind of imagine a situation? Do we imagine a scenario playing out where you've got these two farmers that are working in a field and there's an accident and somebody loses a hand or a foot or an eye or something like that? And so because this person got hurt, because of this person's mistake, now this person gets a free shot on this person. Do you remember free shots? I remember being a kid and playing dodgeball. Now, this was back in the day when you had real dodgeballs. You know what I mean? Like those rubber ones that left mark. They would leave welts all over the place. That was character building, right? See the dodgeballs today? They're so weak. You don't even feel it. It's like, come on. But I mean, those are the ones. How many of you are still traumatized by the sound of the dodgeball? Do you know what I mean? Yes. Oh, it was brutal. I remember when I was a kid, we'd be playing dodgeball, and inevitably somebody would break the rule, right? They would cross the center line intentionally in order to just drill somebody. They wanted to nail somebody, and so they would intentionally step across and just blast them. And we had this rule. I don't know if you guys did this, but we had this rule where if somebody did something like that, the person who broke the rule would have to stand against a wall. And the one who got hit would get a free shot. We had a line that was maybe about 10 feet back. And now they weren't allowed to cross the line, but they were allowed to do anything in order to get up to that line. And so they got one free shot. And usually what they would do is they'd get way back and get a good running start and chuck that ball as hard as they could. Now, if they hit them, great. If not, that was your one shot, but they would get a free shot, right? And I think a lot of times when we read this verse, this is what we picture, only instead of dodgeballs, we're talking about things like cutting off limbs and plucking out eyes and knocking out teeth. And that's rough and that's brutal and that's harsh. And we hear that, we're like, like, I don't know if I like that. And in fact, maybe you're here today and maybe you're not really a Bible person. And the reason why you're not is because of verses like this. You say, if God is really that gory, if God is really that violent, then I don't know that I can really get into this whole God thing. And what we need to understand is that when the Bible says and when Jesus talks about an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, that is not meant to be literal. That is a Hebrew idiom. And the idea behind this idiom is that the punishment should fit the crime. In Latin, this is known as lex talionis. And this is something that you see in almost every culture. We do this to a degree as well. The idea here is that the punishment should fit the crime. When it talks about punishment, usually, most of the time, it's talking about like financial compensation. It's talking about money. Sometimes you're gonna see it literal. For example, if you murder somebody, well then that's gonna cost you a life as well. But the vast majority of the time, it's talking about some sort of financial compensation. And they would have this entire system in place in order to compensate people for being hurt. And the reason this was such a big deal is because whenever you get hurt, and you guys know this, whenever somebody wrongs you, how many of us feel the temptation to get revenge? Right? Oh, we don't call it revenge. What do we say? I gotta get even. They hurt us, they wronged me. I've got to get even. And the problem when it comes to getting even, and if you're honest with yourself, you'll admit this, is that what I want to do to you is worse than what you did to me, right? And the reason this is because from our point of view, from our perspective, what they did to us was way worse than anything that we could do to them. Part of this is because they started it. And when they start it, well, that adds extra to it. And so what happens? We plot, we get revenge, and in our mind, we're even, but in their mind, we're not, because we just raised the bar, didn't we? Oh, now it's on. And so they raise the bar, and they get revenge. Well, now we're uneven again, because from my point of view, what they did to me the second time was worse than anything that I could do to them. Do you see how this escalates? Do you see how revenge spirals out? And you know this. How many times have you ever watched a feud? Two people fighting and it just kind of grows and it escalates and it gets worse and eventually it even begins to bring in all of these other people, right? The problem with the feud, the problem with revenge, it always escalates. And the reason that lex talionis was so important is it kept this in check. It was a clear set of standards. So if somebody did this, this is what you owed. And in fact, by the first century, the rabbis had this entire system. They had kind of 5 different stages or 5 different levels of justice and crime and punishment. For example, the first one had to do with permanent injuries, right? And so if you're working with somebody, there's an accident and you lose a leg, well, then they owe you this amount of money because this is a permanent injury. You're probably not going to work again. And you've still got to provide for your family. They owe you this much. Now, if you're working in the field and you don't lose a leg, but you break a leg, it's a temporary injury, well, then they had another level for that. And so you had permanent injuries, you had temporary injuries, and then you had something involving healing. That was the third stage. And so if there was medicine involved, or maybe there's some doctors or healers involved, that was the third stage. The fourth stage for them had to do with pain, just like in our world, right? You've got pain and suffering. So if you experience pain because of somebody else, then they owe you this much money. And then the last stage, the last level was for shame. Remember, and we'll see a great example of this here in just a minute, but they're living in an honor and shame culture where shame was worse than death. And so if somebody shamed you, they owed you this much money. And the reason this is so important is because what you had community-wide was a clear set of standards. If they did this to you, this was the compensation. And the great part about that is once you had the compensation, you can move on. You could find healing. Otherwise, when you get stuck in the cycle of revenge, it just keeps going, doesn't it? And so understand that what Jesus is talking about here, when he talks about an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, he's referring to their legal system in their day. And in their time, this was the law of the land. And with that in mind, check out what he says next. Again, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, and whenever you see this formula, you have heard it said, but I say again, that is a reference to a new teaching. And what Jesus is doing here is quoting to us, or at least referencing Psalm 37. You can write that one down, read it later. I'm telling you, you're going to see some good stuff in there. Psalm 37, I go to like 1 through 11 maybe. There's some good stuff. But he says this. He says, do not resist the one who is evil. Couple of things I want you to notice. The first thing, I'm going to be honest, I don't like this translation a whole lot. I think a better translation is to say, do not get even with the one who is evil. And I think we'll see why here in the next verse. But again, don't get even with the one who is evil. And the key to understanding this then is understanding that the context is people who are evil. What he's not talking about is people who are wanting to take responsibility. Somebody hurt somebody else, it was an accident, and they're willing to take responsibility. Jesus is not saying, look, refuse the payment, like push back and say, no, because Jesus understands that there's an accident there. And if you lost your leg or legs, you're probably not going to be able to work for a living, and that's a very big deal in their culture. And so, yeah, take the compensation. What Jesus is going to talk about is specifically people who are evil or who have an evil heart or evil intentions. Then he goes on to say this, and this is where it's going to get interesting. Verse 39 continues, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. All right, now, I've heard a lot of people explain this verse in a whole lot of ways. And so what I want to do is try to clear the air and explain this. And really what I want to do is demonstrate this one. Now, I was going to have my wife come up and demonstrate because I thought that would have been very, very fitting. Unfortunately for her, she is in the back working with kids. So I'm going to do the next best thing. I'm going to invite my daughter Eden up on the stage, and she's going to demonstrate what it looks like to slap somebody. So while she's coming up, just one thing you need to understand here. In their culture, every single social interaction, you can come on up, every single social interaction was done with the right hand, okay? Never the left hand. That was used for sanitary stuff. Every single social interaction was done with the right hand. I can't tell you how excited she is about this. So when it comes to slapping somebody, understand that it has to be done with the right hand. Now I'm going to take my microphone off here in just a second. But what I want you to do when I get it off is to demonstrate for everybody what it looks like to slap somebody with the right hand. And so why don't you go ahead and show us. What does that look like? There it is. Come on, hit it. We practiced. She was gentle. She's got a lot of her mother in her, and she practiced a lot harder than that. But I am grateful. I am grateful. Okay, good. So when you hit me, how did you hit me? Where did you hit me? On this side, right? Let me ask you, where did she hit me? On the right cheek or the left cheek? On the left cheek. Awesome, thank you. What does Jesus say? Before that, what cheek? He's very... The right cheek. If you've got your Bible, underline that. Because what Jesus is doing here is he's being specific. And when Jesus is specific about something, he's talking about something specific in their world, right? Now, with that said, what does it look like to slap me on the right cheek? Show everybody what that looks like. Awesome. She intentionally didn't do that one hard. That would have been bad. Good. Okay, notice she's hitting me with what? The front of her hand or the back? The back of her hand. Awesome, thank you. Let's give it up for Eden. She was so excited about this. She's striking me with the back of her hand. And so what Jesus then is talking about, in order to hit somebody on the right cheek, you have to use the back of your hand. And in this first century world, a backhanded blow like that was a very, very, very serious insult. And in fact, this is one that was so big, it was actually covered under lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That there was a monetary value. And in fact, check this out. For an open-handed blow, like she did the first time, that would have cost somebody 200 zuz. Now, I'll kind of explain that here in a minute. For a backhanded blow, that would have cost somebody 400 zuz. Now, I know what we're thinking, like, how much is a zuz? Because I want to know an X equals blank. Like, what does it look like in our culture? And unfortunately, I did a ton of research on this. Nobody has a really clear answer. And there's a lot of different factors for this. But to help us understand how much a zuz was, understand that it was a little bit different than most money in the ancient world because it was made of pure silver. And so we're talking about a whole lot of money. And so if somebody is giving you a backhanded blow, that is one of the ultimate ways that you could shame somebody in their culture. And they owed you money because of their action. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're like, man, that much money? By the way, my best guesstimate would be somewhere around $1,500 to $2,000 for 400 zuz, which is a pretty good amount of money, right? How many of you are thinking, man, wish somebody would slap me? I could use an extra $2,000. Like, that sounds pretty sweet. I don't mind. Again, remember, shame was worse than death. This is a very, very, very big deal. And so if somebody strikes you on the right cheek, what does Jesus say then? Turn the other one, right? Now, this is where I've heard people go on lots of different tangents and go to all kinds of different conclusions. One of the big ones that I hear is that what Jesus is doing here is talking about pacifism. If you're not familiar with that phrase, pacifism is focusing on nonviolence and a nonviolent response even to violent situations. And to be honest, that's a bit of a tough sell because the whole argument that scholars will have when it talks about the nonviolent pacifism is they claim that an open-handed slap would be a way of treating somebody as an equal. And that's a tough sell to me. And the reason it's a tough sell is according to the Mishnah, I just talked about it, it still would have cost you something. It was still something that would have brought shame into your life. And just because they hit you first with the backhand and then hit you with the open hand, that wouldn't have reduced the shame. That actually would have added on. You see, they're making the argument that the reason Jesus says turn the other cheek is he's trying to get them to treat you as an equal. And I don't think that's the point Jesus is making. I don't think Jesus here in this story is trying to say, look, this is how you get even with the person. I think what Jesus is trying to do is reveal the heart of your attacker. What Jesus is trying to do is reveal the heart of this person to the community around them, that this is a person who does not care about human life. And if this person is an evildoer, because remember, that is the context here. If this person really is an evildoer, then there are going to be times in the future where they're going to do something else. In the community, when trial comes up, they're going to remember the time that they hit you with both the backhand and the open hand. And that would have devalued their opinion, thus protecting not only yourself, but other people down the line from harm from that person. Does that make sense? I hope so, because I'm going on. Verse 40. He says, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Now, I want you to notice the words tunic and cloak because these are key. And these are a little bit tricky, by the way, because what we're doing is we're looking at English words that are coming from Greek words that are describing very specific Hebrew clothes. And so we've got some levels of translation that we're trying to go through here. Now, the word tunic here is talking about an outer garment. In the Hebrew, this is probably referring to the talit or the prayer shawl. This would have gone on top of your clothes. Now, the word cloak is where we run into a little bit of problem because when you picture a cloak, what do you picture? Kind of like a cape, right? Something that you wear on the outside, on top of your clothes. And the problem is that's not really an accurate word of what Jesus is trying to describe. What he's describing here is your undergarment, what they would have called your haluk. Now, in their world, to take somebody's haluk was, let's just say it was an intolerable offense. This is something that you even see in the law in Exodus, that you were not allowed to keep somebody else's undergarment. You were allowed to take it, interestingly enough, up to midnight or till the evening, but you weren't allowed to keep it overnight. I don't know why you would have it in the first place. That seems weird. But again, different cultures, let's assume there's a reason. But you were not allowed to keep it overnight. And the reason is because the haluk was just a basic human right. That everybody should have the dignity to be able to clothe themselves. And in fact, by the first century, the haluk was considered to be a poor man's bedding. It was the very basic foundational right that every human being had. And so for somebody to take that revealed the heart of this person. Again, Jesus is all about revealing the heart of your accusers and your attackers. It would reveal to everybody that this is a person who cares more about money and themselves than they care about the kingdom of God. Verse 41. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now again, like so many other things, what this is referring to is something specific in their world. This has to do with Roman soldiers. The problem is that Roman taxes didn't cover everything that the Roman army needed. And because of that, they were allowed to requisition whatever they needed and whatever they wanted from ordinary citizens. One of the most common ways that they would do this was by making and forcing people to carry their stuff and their supplies, even on the Sabbath, by the way, which is why I think there's kind of the legal restriction of 1 mile, because it kind of kept people from getting too angry and too frustrated. And so they were allowed to just kind of make people carry things whenever they wanted. In fact, we see this in the story of Jesus. You remember the crucifixion? Jesus is on his way to Golgotha. He's been beaten beyond reason. He's very weak. He's very tired. I mean, the whipping that he went through was absolutely brutal. Most people died during the beating. Jesus is carrying his cross, and at some point, like, his body just gives out, right? The Romans go to one random dude, and they're like, hey, you, carry it. I don't know that I want to be involved in that. How about you? Like, I don't want to get involved. I want to mind my own business. But according to their laws and their rules, those Roman soldiers had the right to force that person into that situation, into that scenario. Let me ask you, has there ever been a time in your life when somebody kind of dropped something on you at the last minute? And there was that part of you that was like, I don't want to do it. I'm going to have to say no. Or sometimes it's family and you can't say no. And so you do it, but you're like the whole time you're grumbling. Okay, no, nobody does that. Good. This is just a part of life. Sometimes we have to do the things that we don't want to do. And so notice what Jesus says. He says, if somebody says go 1 mile, go 2. Now be careful here, guys, because our temptation is to turn this into a legalistic thing. Oh, thank goodness. Just another mile. I just need to do a little bit more than what people expected. That's not the point that Jesus is making. Jesus is saying, look, go 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles. Go above and beyond. That we, as followers of him, should be people who don't just do the bare minimum. We should exceed the expectations of others. We'll talk about that more in a sec. Let's look at this, verse 42. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. Now, when it came to giving to the poor, there were certain legal restrictions that people had, right? Everybody had to give to a degree. We've talked about this if you've been with us. Leviticus talks about when you reap the harvest of your field, leave the corners, right? For the poor, the strangers, the orphans, those who can't take care of themselves. That we're to leave something, but notice Leviticus doesn't say how much. And the good news of that is you're free to leave. You're free to give as much as you want to give. You can give the whole field if you want. That is your right. You are free to give as much as you want. Now, the problem was then is that a lot of rabbis in this first century world and a lot of religious people would actually give themselves into poverty. They would just give and give and give and give and give until they were in poverty. And so by the time the first century rolls around and by the time Jesus is teaching, there were a lot of restrictions on how much people were allowed to give. And so what Jesus is doing here is saying, okay, no, you've got this wrong. You're free to give as much as you want. that if you want to give everything. And what I want you to notice, because as we've gone through this teaching, we've talked about a lot of different things, right? We've talked about eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We've talked about being hit. We've talked about, like giving our clothes to other people. We've talked about carrying supply. We've talked about a lot of different things. But what I want you to notice is that the theme that connects every single one of these is that we are to be generous people. That we are to be people who go above and beyond. And again, the problem is that we live in a culture that focuses on the bare minimum, don't we? I mean, can we just be painfully honest here? How many of us in the different areas and categories of life focus on the minimum? When we spend time with our family, how much time do we spend giving the least amount? Like, I'm with you, I'm watching the movie with you, but I'm gonna be on my phone checking Facebook the whole time. How many of us, when we're at the table, are spending our whole times on our tablets instead of connecting with the people right in front of us? But I'm here. We focus on the bare minimum. How many of us in our friendships focus on the bare minimum? Like, I want friends who are there for me, right? But how many times are we willing to be there for them? How many times are we willing to drop everything, go pick up ice cream because he broke up with her or she broke up with him? And I'm gonna be there, I'm going to listen. I think you're crazy, but I love you. And I'm gonna stay with you, whatever it takes. I'm gonna go above and beyond. At school, how many of us go above and beyond? You get stuck on a group project, and you're the one who works, right? Because in a group, there's always one worker and nobody else wants to. And so the one worker does everything. And there's always that temptation, well, I'm only going to do a little bit because I don't want them to get good credit, good grades for my work. And so we want to pull back. But we're called to be people who go above and beyond, who exceed the expectations of others. Maybe it's at work. How many times do we go to work and we clock in or we walk in? It's like, I got my checklist for the day. Thankfully, there's not a lot. I've just got this and this to do. And then I'm free to do whatever I want. And so we sit back and we relax and we get by with the bare minimum. You see, the problem is we're called to be people who raise the bar, who raise the standard, who go above and beyond. I've got my checklist and I just got a couple of things. But you know what? I'm going to go to my neighbor and say, what do you need? I'm going to go to my boss and say, what can I do to help? I'm going to take some time on my own and take my one project and say, how can I make it better so that I am bringing my absolute best into this moment? Because as followers of Jesus, we are to be people who are going above and beyond. Because that's what Jesus did for us. Because here in a moment, we're going to celebrate communion. And we've got different stations all throughout. We've got gluten-free in the back. And what I love about the cross is that Jesus refused to quit. Because he loved us so much, he went above and beyond. He took the beating and kept going. He went to the cross and refused to quit. Because he loved us so much, he wanted a relationship with us so much that he was going to do whatever it takes. And because Jesus lived a life of extravagant generosity, we need to be people who do the same for others. Because when other people, again, the word Christian, Christ-like, little Christian, when people look at us, they should see Jesus in and through our lives. Are they seeing the Jesus who was willing to go above and beyond? Or are they seeing a Jesus who just did enough to break even? Are we the type of people who are exceeding the expectations of others, who are going above and beyond to be a light to the world and to show Jesus in and through our lives? Let me pray. God, I thank you. Thank you for today. For this moment, for this opportunity that we have to be like you, to be a disciple of you. to be a light to the world, to reflect you through our lives. God, I pray that you would give us eyes to see the opportunities and the moments that you've given to us. Don't let us miss the things that you've placed right in front of us because of our laziness and because we refuse to even look for the things that you're doing. God, give us eyes to see the opportunities that you've given to us to serve the people in the community around us. And give us the courage to do it, to step in those moments, even when they're inconvenient, even when we don't want to. God, I thank you for Jesus. I thank you for his sacrifice. I thank you for the cross. I thank you for his generosity. Because his generosity should be the fuel, should be our motivation for our generosity to the world. God, help us to be like Jesus in the lives that we live and the way that we love each other. For it's in his name that we pray.